Molly Bennett wiped the sweat from her forehead as she navigated through the chaos of Meridian 7's central marketplace. After 3 straight weeks coordinating refugee supplies, she deserved a break, and the market was her favorite place to unwind. The massive space station orbited between 3 different star systems, making it a hub for traders from dozens of worlds. The air smelled like a mixture of exotic spices, engine grease, and something she couldn't quite identify but had learned to ignore. She moved past stalls selling everything from crystalline data chips to what looked like live plants that hummed when you got close. Vendors called out in languages her translator earpiece worked overtime to decode. A tall, 6-armed merchant tried to sell her some kind of fruit that changed colors. She smiled politely and kept walking, her shopping bag already half full of the basics she actually needed. That's when she heard it. A sound that cut through all the market noise like a knife. Crying. Not just any crying, but the kind of desperate, terrified sobbing that made her chest tighten. Molly stopped in her tracks and looked around. Other shoppers were hurrying past a narrow gap between 2 vendor stalls, their faces showing discomfort or concern, but nobody was stopping. She pushed through the crowd and found the source. A child stood there, no taller than her waist, with scales that shimmered between blue and purple in the market lights. The little one had large eyes that reminded her of an owl's, currently brimming with tears that left wet tracks down their face. Their small hands were clenched into fists, and they were shaking. Molly glanced around. Where were this kid's parents? Guardians? Anyone? The crowd kept moving past, and she noticed something odd. People weren't just ignoring the child, they were actively avoiding them. She saw a hulking alien with tusks literally step around the crying kid without even glancing down. A group of traders gave the child a wide berth, their expressions shifting from sympathy to something that looked almost like fear. That didn't sit right with Molly. At all. She took a step closer, and the child's crying intensified. The little one looked around frantically, clearly lost and terrified. Molly's heart broke. She'd seen enough scared kids in her relief work to recognize pure panic when she saw it. The species didn't matter. Fear looked the same everywhere. She crouched down slowly, making herself smaller and less threatening. The child noticed her and took a stumbling step backward, pressing against the wall of a stall. The vendor inside peeked out, saw what was happening, and quickly retreated. Weird reaction, but Molly didn't have time to think about it. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly, keeping her voice calm and gentle. "It's okay. You're safe. I promise." The child stared at her with those huge, wet eyes. Their crying had reduced to hiccuping sobs, but they still looked absolutely terrified. Molly opened her arms slowly, the universal gesture she'd used with frightened children on a dozen different worlds. "I know you're scared. I know everything seems really big and confusing right now. But it's going to be okay. I'm going to help you find your family. Would that be all right?" The child hesitated for maybe 3 seconds. Then, with a heartbreaking little whimper, they ran straight into Molly's arms. She wrapped them up in a hug, feeling the child's whole body trembling against her. The scales felt smooth and warm, and she could feel a rapid heartbeat, or whatever this species had, racing against her chest. Sure, it's okay now. I've got you. You're safe," Molly murmured, rocking slightly the way her mother used to rock her when she was small. She started humming an old lullaby without even thinking about it, something about stars and sailing ships that her grandmother had taught her. The child's crying began to subside. Their breathing slowed down. The shaking gradually stopped. Molly kept humming, kept holding them, kept providing the one thing every scared kid in the universe needed, someone who gave a damn. She became aware of silence spreading around them. The constant buzz of the marketplace had dropped to hushed whispers. When she looked up, still holding the child, she found dozens of faces staring at them. Not just curious stares. These people looked shocked. Some looked horrified. A few had their mouths literally hanging open. "What?" she asked, confused by all the attention. The kid was scared and alone. What was I supposed to do? Nobody answered. They just kept staring. Then she heard boots. Heavy boots. Multiple pairs, moving fast. Station security burst through the crowd, 6 officers in full tactical gear. They stopped dead when they saw her holding the child, and their faces went pale. Actually pale, which was impressive considering 2 of them were already pretty light-colored to begin with. The lead officer, a human woman named Rodriguez that Molly had seen around the station, looked like she might pass out. Her hand went to her communication device, and she spoke in a tight, controlled voice that suggested barely contained panic. "Command, this is Rodriguez. We've located the VIP. Repeat, we have located the VIP. Subject is unharmed and is currently being held by a human civilian. Yes, you heard that right. Held. Physical contact. No, I don't know how. Stand by. VIP? Molly looked down at the child in her arms, who had finally stopped crying and was now resting their head against her shoulder. The little one felt heavy with exhaustion, the way kids do after a really good cry. Rodriguez approached carefully, like Molly was holding a live bomb instead of a tired kid. I need you to very carefully tell me your name and what you're doing with Crown Prince Tavin. Molly's brain stuttered to a halt. Crown, what now? That child you're holding, Rodriguez said slowly, is Crown Prince Tavin of the Drakti Empire. Heir to the most powerful military force in 3 sectors. And you just made physical contact with Drakti royalty, which is, she stopped, looking for words. We need to get you to a secure location immediately. Molly looked down at the prince, who gazed back up at her with trusting eyes. She looked back at the security team. He was crying, she said simply. He needed a hug. Rodriguez closed her eyes briefly, like she was praying for patience. Unauthorized physical contact with Drakti royalty is traditionally punishable by execution. We need to move. Now. The security team escorted Molly through a maze of corridors she'd never seen before. Prince Tavin had finally been gently extracted from her arms by a nervous medic wearing what looked like insulated gloves. The little prince had reached for her as they took him away, making soft distressed noises that broke her heart all over again. She'd smiled at him and waved, trying to show him everything was fine, even though she had no idea if that was true. Now she sat in a comfortable room that was definitely not a cell, but the locked door suggested she wasn't exactly free to leave either. There was a couch, a table with water and what might have been alien snacks, and a window showing the stars outside. 2 guards stood outside her door. For her protection, Rodriguez had said. Molly wasn't sure she believed that. She'd been there maybe 20 minutes when Rodriguez returned with another officer, this one a tall alien with purple skin and way too many eyes. They both looked stressed. Ms. Bennett, Rodriguez began, sitting across from her. I need you to understand the situation you're in. The Drakti are not like humans. They're a touch telepathic species. Physical contact between them is intimate, sacred, and strictly regulated. Only family members touch each other. Only family. He was a scared kid, Molly said quietly. I didn't know. I understand that, Rodriguez interrupted gently. But to the Drakti, what you did is unthinkable. Their children emit psychic energy when distressed. Most species find it uncomfortable. When a Drakti child is truly panicking, like Prince Tavin was, that energy becomes a weapon. It should have knocked you unconscious. It should have felt like needles in your brain. But you just held him. For nearly 5 minutes. Molly blinked. I didn't feel anything except a kid who needed help. The multi-eyed officer leaned forward. That's what nobody understands. We've reviewed the security footage. You walked through a psychic field that made trained security personnel vomit. You held the prince through energy spikes that should have stopped your heart. And you acted like you were comforting any normal child. Because I was, Molly said, frustration creeping into her voice. Look, I don't have any special powers. I'm just a relief worker who's good at calming down scared kids. I've done it on 6 different worlds. This isn't. The door opened. Everyone in the room immediately stood up, and Molly followed their lead without thinking. A woman entered, and Molly didn't need anyone to tell her this was someone important. She was tall, with scales that were darker than Tavin's, almost black with hints of deep red. She wore robes that looked both elegant and practical, and her eyes, the same large, expressive eyes as the prince, were currently fixed on Molly with an intensity that made her want to squirm. Out, the woman said quietly. Rodriguez and the other officer practically tripped over themselves leaving. The door closed, and Molly was alone with someone who was very clearly Drakti royalty. You're the Empress, Molly said. It wasn't a question. I am Empress Kyra. And you are the human who touched my son. Her voice was controlled, but Molly could hear something underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated. I didn't mean any disrespect, Molly said carefully. I just saw a child who was frightened and alone. Sit, Kyra commanded, and they both sat today. The Empress studied her for a long moment. Do you know what should have happened to you? When you touched Tavin during his episode? They said I should have been knocked out. At minimum. Most beings would have suffered permanent neurological damage. Several of Tavin's handlers have required months of medical treatment after much briefer contact. Kyra's expression remained neutral, but her hands tightened on the armrests of her chair. Yet you held my son. You comforted him. You survived something that should have killed you. Molly didn't know what to say to that. The Empress continued, her voice dropping lower. My son has what your people would call an anxiety disorder. In Drakti culture, this is shameful. Weakness. Our people are warriors, and a weak heir is unacceptable to many. We have hidden his condition, protected him, tried every treatment our medicine offers. Nothing works. His episodes are getting worse. He injures people who try to help him, not intentionally, but because his mind is screaming and his gifts respond to that fear. That's not his fault, Molly said firmly. Anxiety isn't a choice. It's not weakness either. It's just something some people deal with. Kyra's eyes widened slightly. You speak as though you have experience. My little brother had panic attacks when he was young. Different species, same problem. He needed patience and understanding, not shame. Molly met the Empress's gaze steadily. Your son isn't weak. He's scared. There's a difference. The Empress was quiet for a moment. Then, to Molly's surprise, her rigid posture softened just slightly. I have watched the security footage 17 times. I watched you approach my son while others fled. I watched you hold him through an episode that should have killed you. And I watched his psychic field simply stop. Not because you blocked it or fought it, but because you did not fear it. I didn't know it was there, Molly admitted. Exactly. Kyra leaned forward. You were not afraid of him. You did not see a dangerous alien prince. You saw a child who needed comfort. And somehow, that made all the difference. Your mind did not resist his psychic cry because you did not perceive a threat. You perceived a child in need. Molly absorbed this. So what happens now? Am I going to be executed for helping your kid? No. The word was firm and immediate. But I need to ask something of you, and you may refuse. If you do, you will be free to go with my gratitude and a formal apology from the Drakti Empire. Kyra's mask of imperial control cracked, and for just a moment, Molly saw a mother desperate to help her child. Will you stay? Will you help us understand why you can reach my son when no one else can? Will you teach us how to help him the way you did? Molly thought about that scared little boy, about his tears and his trembling. She thought about her brother at that age, lost in panic that seemed to have no end. She thought about the Empress sitting across from her, a powerful ruler reduced to asking for help from a stranger. Yeah, Molly said. Yeah, I'll stay. But I have conditions. Kyra actually smiled, just a little. Name them. First, nobody treats Tavin like he's broken. He's not. Second, if I'm helping, I do it my way. That means human methods, human understanding of mental health, and no shame or punishment when he has episodes. And third, Molly straightened her shoulders. When this is done, when he's better, I want you to share what we learn with other Drakti families. Because I'm betting Tavin isn't the only one dealing with this. The Empress stood, and Molly stood with her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Kyra extended her hand, human style. When Molly took it, the Empress's grip was firm and warm. You have a bargain, Molly Bennett. And you may have just saved more than my son's life. You may have saved his future. Molly's new quarters were nicer than anywhere she'd ever lived. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the stars, the furniture adjusted to her body automatically, and someone had stocked the kitchen with human food. But luxury wasn't why she'd agreed to stay. The real reason was currently sitting on her couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching her with those huge eyes. Prince Tavin had been brought to her rooms an hour ago, accompanied by 4 nervous attendants who looked ready to jump in at the first sign of trouble. Molly had thanked them politely and asked them to wait outside. They'd looked at her like she'd suggested juggling live grenades, but the Empress had apparently given orders. What Molly said went. Now it was just her and a 6-year-old alien prince who was supposed to be terrifying but mostly just looked tired. Are you hungry? Molly asked, sitting on the opposite end of the couch, giving him space. I've got some crackers. Not sure if you can eat them, but they're pretty good. Tavin shook his head slightly. His scales had shifted to a muted gray color. Molly didn't know much about Drakti biology yet, but she was learning that their scales reflected their emotional state. Gray seemed to mean sadness or exhaustion. It's okay to be quiet, Molly said gently. You've had a really big day. Scary day, probably. The prince nodded. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, You're not afraid of me. His translator made his voice sound like a young child's, which he was. Molly smiled. Should I be afraid of you? Everyone else is. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself. They wear special gloves. Special suits. They stay far away. Mother can only touch me when she wears the shield device, and even then, not for long. Father tries but it hurts him. I don't mean to hurt anyone. I don't want to. Molly's heart squeezed. She'd heard enough kids blame themselves for things beyond their control. Tavin, can I tell you something? None of that is your fault. Not even a little bit. But I make the bad feeling happen. The screaming in people's heads. The doctors say my mind is too loud when I'm scared. Your mind isn't the problem. Your mind is doing exactly what it's supposed to do when you're frightened. It's trying to protect you. Molly shifted slightly closer. My little brother used to have panic attacks. His body would shake, his heart would race, sometimes he couldn't breathe. It looked scary, but it was just his body trying to keep him safe from danger, even when there wasn't real danger there. Does that make sense? Tavin considered this. Is your brother okay now? He's doing great. He learned ways to help himself when the scary feelings came. And the people around him learned to help too, instead of making him feel bad about it. Molly smiled. That's what we're going to do for you. We're going to figure out what helps. The door chimed, and Empress Kyra entered. She moved carefully, watching the space between Molly and her son. Tavin sat up straighter, and his scales shifted toward blue with streaks of purple. Nervous, Molly guessed. Mother, he said formally. Tavin. Kyra's voice was warm but controlled. She looked at Molly. I hope my son has not been difficult. He's been wonderful, Molly said honestly. We're getting to know each other. Kyra moved to a chair across from them. Molly noticed she kept her distance from Tavin, and the careful way she held herself. Like she wanted to reach for him but didn't dare. I wanted to explain something to you both, Kyra began. Molly, you asked why this is happening. Why Tavin's condition exists. I have consulted with our top scientists, and they believe they have an answer. Tavin's scales rippled with anxiety. Molly reached over without thinking and rested her hand on his shoulder. The prince immediately relaxed, leaning slightly into the contact. Kyra's eyes widened, tracking the movement. You just did it again, the Empress said quietly. You touched him during a stress response. Do you feel anything? Any pressure in your head? Any discomfort? Molly concentrated. No. Just a kid who's a little tense. Should I feel something else? Yes. You should feel his psychic field activating. It's reading at moderate levels right now on our senses. Not enough to cause damage, but enough that most beings would be experiencing significant discomfort. Kyra pulled out a small device and showed Molly a screen with fluctuating waves. This measures psychic energy. See these spikes? That's Tavin's field responding to stress. But I don't feel it, Molly said, confused. Because you don't expect to feel it. Because you don't fear it. Because when you look at my son, you see only a child who needs comfort. Kyra's voice grew thick with emotion. Our scientists believe that Tavin's psychic field is essentially a feedback loop. When people fear it, their minds resist, which makes it stronger, which makes them fear it more. It escalates. But you break that loop because you have no fear response to trigger it. So I'm not special, Molly said. I'm just ignorant in a helpful way. Kyra laughed, a short surprised sound. Perhaps. Or perhaps your ignorance is a kind of wisdom we have lost. We Drakti are taught from birth to respect the power of psychic touch, to fear unauthorized contact, to maintain rigid boundaries. These teachings protect us, but they also mean we approach Tavin's episodes expecting pain. An expectation becomes reality. Tavin had been listening quietly. Now he spoke up, his young voice uncertain. So I'm not broken? Both women looked at him. Kyra's mask of imperial control cracked completely. She moved to kneel in front of the couch, close to her son but still not touching him. No, my starlight. You are not broken. You are sensitive in a universe that values strength. You feel deeply in a culture that prizes control. These things make you different, not defective. Then why does everyone act like I'm dangerous? The question hung in the air. Molly watched Kyra struggle with how to answer her son honestly while still being a mother. Finally, the Empress spoke. Because we are afraid. Drakti culture is built on warrior traditions, on strength and power and dominance. We have conquered 3 sectors through military might. We have survived countless threats by being harder, colder, more fearsome than our enemies. She reached toward Tavin's hand, stopping just short of touching him. But we never learned how to be gentle. We never learned that there is strength in softness, power in vulnerability. You are teaching us these lessons, but they frighten us because they challenge everything we believe about ourselves. That's garbage, Molly said bluntly. Both Drakti looked at her in surprise. Sorry, but it is. You're telling a 6-year-old that he has to carry the weight of changing an entire culture's values? That's not fair to him. What would you suggest? Kyra asked, and there was no hostility in the question, only genuine curiosity. I'd suggest you start by being his mom, not his empress. I'd suggest you stop treating every moment with him like a diplomatic crisis and start treating them like what they are, time with your kid. Molly stood up, gently pulling Tavin up with her. Here's what we're going to do. Your Majesty, you're going to sit on this couch. Tavin, you're going to sit next to your mom. And I'm going to show you both something humans do when someone's feeling anxious. What is that? Kyra asked, moving to the couch uncertainly. We teach them that touch doesn't have to be scary. That human contact can heal instead of hurt. Molly guided Tavin to sit next to his mother, then positioned herself on his other side. Tavin, I want you to take some deep breaths with me. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that? The prince nodded and started breathing with her. Slowly, Molly guided Kyra's hand toward her son's. Your Majesty, I want you to think about the first time you held him as a baby. Before you knew about his condition. Before you were afraid. Can you remember that? Kyra's eyes glistened. Yes. Hold that feeling. Just that feeling. Not empress to heir. Mother to son. Their hands touched. Tavin tensed, his scales flickering rapidly. But Kyra didn't pull away, and Molly kept her own hand on Tavin's shoulder, a grounding presence. Slowly, so slowly, the prince relaxed. His scales shifted to a warm amber color. It doesn't hurt, Kyra whispered, wonder in her voice. I'm touching my son, and it doesn't hurt. A single tear rolled down her face, and Molly realized this mother hadn't been able to simply hold her child in years. The political implications of Tavin's condition, the military concerns, the cultural complications, all of that was real. But right now, in this moment, it was just a mom finally able to touch her son without pain. This is just the beginning, Molly said softly. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. But this right here? This is possible. This is real. And we're going to make it so Tavin can have this every day. 3 weeks into her stay on Meridian 7, Molly had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible that first day in the market. Every morning, Prince Tavin came to her quarters for what the Drakti officials formally called therapeutic sessions, but what Molly just thought of as hanging out with a kid who needed a friend. Today, Tavin was teaching her a Drakti game that involved stacking colored crystals in increasingly complicated patterns. He was beating her badly, and seemed delighted about it. You have to think 3 moves ahead, he explained patiently, his scales a happy shade of bright teal. See? If you put the blue one there, I can just knock down your whole tower with the red. I'm starting to think you're hustling me, Molly said, pretending to be suspicious. Did you let me win yesterday just to make me feel confident? Tavin's laugh was the best sound she'd heard all week. When she'd first met him, she wasn't sure he knew how to laugh. Now he did it several times a day. The door chimed, and Dr. Helen Voss entered, carrying her usual array of monitoring equipment. The human scientist had become a regular presence in these sessions, studying every interaction between Molly and Tavin with the intensity of someone trying to solve the universe's greatest mystery. Don't mind me, Helen said, setting up her sensors. Just pretend I'm not here. Kind of hard when you've got 6 different machines pointed at us, Molly said, but she smiled to show she didn't really mind. Helen was good people, even if she did get a little too excited about psychic energy readings. Can't help it. You two are fascinating. Helen adjusted one of her devices. Tavin, would you mind doing something for me? Think about the day you got lost in the market. Just for a moment. Molly shot Helen a look, but Tavin seemed okay with it. His scales dimmed slightly, shifting toward gray. The crystals in his hands trembled. Good, now Molly, just do what you'd normally do. Molly didn't need to be told twice. She reached over and took one of Tavin's hands in hers. Hey, buddy. You're safe. I'm right here. That scary day is over, remember? You're not lost anymore. Tavin's breathing slowed. His scales brightened back to teal. The trembling stopped. Helen made a noise of pure scientific excitement. Incredible. Your psychic output spiked to dangerous levels, Tavin, but the moment Molly touched you, it redirected. It's like her presence gives your mind an anchor point, something calm to mirror instead of spiraling. I don't understand half of what you just said, Molly admitted. I'm saying you're doing something that shouldn't be possible. Helen showed them her tablet screen, covered in colorful graphs that meant nothing to Molly. Most people's brains instinctively resist psychic intrusion. It's a survival response. But your brain doesn't resist because it doesn't recognize Tavin's field as a threat. Instead, your calm emotional state somehow influences his psychic output, creating a feedback loop of calm instead of panic. So I'm like a living security blanket. More like a biological psychic dampener, but sure, security blanket works too. Helen sat down, her expression turning more serious. The thing is, Molly, we can't rely on you forever. You have your own life. Eventually, you'll want to go back to your relief work. We need to figure out how to help Tavin manage this without you. Molly had been thinking about that too. What if it's not about me specifically? What if it's about the approach? What do you mean? Every Drakti who works with Tavin is trained to expect his psychic field to be dangerous. They wear protective gear, they keep their distance, they're always braced for impact. They're basically walking around broadcasting this kid is a threat with their body language and their thoughts. Molly gestured at Tavin, who was listening with interest. But what if you train people differently? Taught them to approach him the way I do, without fear or expectation of pain. Helen frowned. That's asking people to ignore their survival instincts. No, it's asking them to choose trust over fear. Big difference. Molly looked at Tavin. What do you think? Do you feel it when people are scared of you? Yes, he said quietly. It makes the bad feelings worse. Like their fear feeds my fear, and it gets bigger and bigger until it explodes. Exactly. So we break the cycle. We teach your people, your attendants, your tutors, your family, how to be calm around you. We show them it's possible. Helen looked skeptical. That's asking a lot. Years of cultural conditioning don't just disappear because we ask nicely. Then we start small. With people who are willing to try. Over the next week, Molly worked with 3 of Tavin's regular attendants, a young Drakti named Corvin, an older female called Thessia, and surprisingly, Captain Rodriguez from station security who'd volunteered because, in her words, I've seen enough to know that kid deserves better. The training was simple in concept but hard in practice. Molly taught them breathing exercises, had them practice approaching Tavin when he was calm, and most importantly, worked on shifting their mindset from protecting themselves from the prince to protecting the prince from his own anxiety. Corvin got it first. He was young enough that the cultural conditioning hadn't fully set in, and he genuinely liked Tavin. On the 5th day of training, he managed to sit next to the prince during a mild episode without any protective gear. Tavin's psychic field fluctuated but never spiked to dangerous levels. It's working, Helen confirmed, reviewing the data. Corvin's calm presence actually helped stabilize Tavin's output. It's not as effective as Molly, but it's real progress. Thessia took longer. She'd been raised in a traditional Drakti military family, and the idea of approaching a psychic threat without protection went against everything she'd been taught. But she was also stubborn, and once she committed to something, she didn't give up. By the end of the 2nd week, she could hold Tavin's hand during his calm moments without flinching. Rodriguez turned out to be a natural. I've worked security on 6 different worlds, she explained. You learn pretty quick that responding to fear with more fear just escalates everything. De-escalation is about staying calm when everything around you is chaos. This isn't that different. The real test came when Tavin had a full panic attack during a lesson with his language tutor. The tutor, an older Drakti male named Vector, had been skeptical of Molly's methods but had agreed to try them. When Tavin started to spiral, triggered by frustration over a difficult translation, Vector's instinct was to back away and call for help. Molly, watching from the corner of the room, stayed put. Vector, remember your breathing. He's not attacking you. He's scared and needs grounding. Vector hesitated, then slowly approached Tavin instead of retreating. He sat down beside the prince, his movements deliberate and calm. Prince Tavin, I am here. You are safe. The lesson can wait. Tavin's psychic field was radiating at dangerous levels. Helen's senses were screaming warnings. But Vector kept his breathing steady, kept his body language relaxed, and after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Tavin's panic began to ease. When it was over, Vector sat there trembling slightly, but he was smiling. I felt it. The moment when his mind recognized mine as safe instead of threatening. It was like a door opening instead of a wall going up. You did great, Molly said, meaning it. That was really brave. It wasn't bravery. It was trust. Vector looked at Tavin, who was exhausted but calm now. Trust that what you've been teaching us is real. Trust that the prince doesn't want to hurt anyone. Trust that choosing compassion over fear can actually work. That evening, Molly filed her progress report for Empress Kyra. She included all the data, all the successes, and all the setbacks. But she ended with something more important than numbers. The human variable isn't me, she wrote. It's the choice to see someone struggling and decide to help instead of protecting yourself first. It's believing that compassion is stronger than fear. Every human doesn't have this, plenty of us fail at it every day. But it's something we can teach, something we can practice, something we can choose. And that's what makes it powerful. Tavin doesn't need me specifically. He needs people who are willing to choose trust over fear. The good news is, we're proving that's possible. Even for Drakti. She hit send and looked over at Tavin, who had fallen asleep on her couch, his scales a peaceful shade of deep blue. In 3 weeks, they'd made progress that the Drakti medical establishment had thought impossible. And they were just getting started. The assassination attempt happened on a Tuesday. Molly had just finished a session with Tavin, teaching him a card game her brother used to play when his anxiety got bad. Something simple and repetitive that gave anxious minds something to focus on. The prince was getting good at it, his small hands shuffling the cards with increasing confidence. They were in one of the palace gardens. The Drakti had moved their headquarters to a more permanent facility on Meridian 7, surrounded by plants from a dozen different worlds. Tavin loved the garden. He said the growing things had their own kind of peaceful energy that helped him stay calm. That's when Molly heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A mechanical whir that her years in conflict zones had taught her to recognize instantly. She didn't think. She just moved. Down. She threw herself over Tavin, knocking him to the ground and covering his body with hers. Something hot screamed past her shoulder, close enough that she felt the heat. An energy weapon. The shot hit a tree behind them, and the ancient plant exploded into splinters. Tavin made a frightened sound beneath her, and she felt his psychic field start to spike. I've got you, buddy. Stay down. I've got you. More shots. Security alarms blared. She heard shouting in multiple languages and the heavy thud of running boots. But all of that was background noise. Her entire world had narrowed to the scared child beneath her and keeping him safe. Then something changed. The air around them shimmered, and Molly felt a pressure that wasn't quite physical. It was like the atmosphere had gotten thicker, heavier. Tavin's psychic field was activating, but it felt different than his panic attacks. More focused. More intentional. A rippling barrier of energy materialized around them, translucent but definitely there. Another energy blast hit it and dissipated harmlessly. Tavin wasn't broadcasting fear and pain. He was protecting them. Holy, Molly caught herself. Tavin, are you doing this? I don't want them to hurt you, the prince said, his voice tight with concentration. You protected me. I'm protecting you. Security forces swarmed the garden. Molly heard Captain Rodriguez shouting orders, heard weapons fire, heard someone screaming. But inside Tavin's shield, they were safe. The young prince held that barrier for almost 3 full minutes, until Rodriguez personally confirmed the attackers had been neutralized. When the shield finally dropped, Tavin collapsed against Molly, exhausted. She held him, checking him over for injuries, her hands shaking with adrenaline. You okay? Are you hurt? Tired, he mumbled. Did I do good? You did amazing, buddy. You saved us both. Empress Kyra arrived within minutes, her scales flickering through a dozen colors Molly had never seen before, rage, fear, relief all mixing together. She dropped to her knees beside them, and for the first time since that day on the couch, she pulled her son into her arms without hesitation. No protective gear. No shields. Just a mother holding her child. You're safe. You're both safe, Kyra repeated, like a mantra. She looked at Molly over Tavin's head. You protected him. He protected me too, Molly said. Did you see what he did? That wasn't a panic response. That was controlled. Purposeful. He used his abilities to defend instead of just reacting with fear. Kyra's eyes widened as the implications hit her. His power responded to protective instinct instead of panic. Because he wasn't scared for himself. He was scared for me. That's different. Molly searched for the right words. That's what his abilities were probably meant for all along. Protection. Not aggression. Not even self-defense. Just taking care of someone he cares about. The investigation revealed that the attackers were from a traditionalist faction within the Drakti military. They'd seen reports of Tavin's progress, seen him learning human weakness, and decided a defective heir was worse than no heir at all. They'd planned to eliminate him and blame it on human extremists, hoping to fracture the growing cooperation between Earth and the Drakti Empire. Instead, they'd given Empress Kyra exactly what she needed. The next morning, Kyra called a full assembly of the Drakti Council and broadcast it across 3 sectors. Molly stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention, but the Empress had insisted she be there. 4 generations, Kyra began, her voice carrying the weight of imperial authority, we Drakti have prided ourselves on strength. Military might. The ability to conquer and dominate. We have built an empire on these principles, and they have served us well. The assembled council members nodded, their scales showing approval. But yesterday, extremists who claimed to uphold our values tried to murder my son. Not because he was weak, but because he was learning a different kind of strength. The strength to be vulnerable. The strength to ask for help. The strength to care about others more than yourself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Kyra continued, her voice growing stronger. A human relief worker named Molly Bennett saw my son crying in a marketplace and did something unthinkable. She comforted him. She held him through psychic energy that should have killed her. She did this not because she had special powers or military training. She did it because she saw a child in pain and decided that helping him was more important than protecting herself from potential harm. Kyra gestured to Molly, who wanted to disappear into the floor. This human has taught us something our entire culture forgot. That there is courage in compassion. That there is strength in admitting you need help. That the most powerful thing you can sometimes do is simply choose to care. The Empress pulled up footage of the assassination attempt on the massive screens behind her. The council watched Molly throw herself over Tavin, watched the prince's shield manifest, watched them protect each other. My son's abilities, which we saw as a curse, saved both their lives yesterday. Not because he panicked. Not because he lashed out in fear. But because he wanted to protect someone who had shown him kindness. His power responded to love instead of fear, and in doing so, revealed what it was truly meant for. Kyra let that sink in before delivering her final statement. I am proposing a formal alliance with Earth. Not a trade agreement. Not a military pact. A cultural exchange. We will send Drakti to learn human approaches to mental health, emotional support, and what Molly calls giving a damn about each other. In return, Earth will gain access to our technology, our resources, and our protection. The council erupted in debate. Some were supportive, others outraged. But Kyra raised her hand for silence. This is not optional. This is the future. My son will one day rule this empire, and he will rule with both the strength we have always valued and the compassion we are learning to embrace. Those who cannot accept this are welcome to leave. But this is the path we are taking. The alliance was formalized within a month. Molly became the first human cultural liaison to the Drakti Empire, a position she'd never wanted but couldn't refuse. Earth sent therapists, counselors, teachers specializing in childhood development. The Drakti sent engineers, scientists, military strategists. But the real work happened quietly, in small moments. Drakti parents learning it was okay to admit their children struggled. Warriors discovering that talking about fear didn't make you weak. A culture slowly, painfully, beginning to understand that strength came in many forms. Years later, at Tavin's coronation, the young emperor stood before his people with scales that shimmered with confidence and calm. Molly stood beside the imperial family, wearing the simple clothes she preferred alongside the highest civilian honor the Drakti could grant, a crystal pendant that marked her as Keeper of the Shield, a title created specifically for her. In his coronation speech, Emperor Tavin told the story that had already become legend among his people. The story of a human stranger who saw a crying child in a market and decided to help. The story of how one simple act of kindness had challenged an empire's values and won. She didn't see an alien prince, Tavin said, his voice carrying across the vast assembly. She didn't see a political complication or a diplomatic crisis. She saw someone who needed a hug. And that changed everything. He looked directly at Molly, and she saw in his eyes the confident young leader he'd become. The anxiety would always be part of him, that hadn't magically disappeared. But he'd learned to work with it instead of fighting it. He'd learned that needing help wasn't weakness. He'd learned that the strongest shields were built from compassion. My reign will be guided by a principle this human taught me, Emperor Tavin continued. That the most powerful thing we can do is choose to care. That seeing someone in pain and deciding to help, even at risk to ourselves, is the highest form of courage. This is the strength that built alliances across the stars. This is the strength that will carry us into the future. After the ceremony, Molly found a quiet corner of the palace, overwhelmed by the crowds and the attention. Tavin found her there, still wearing his ceremonial robes. "Hiding?" he asked, amused. "Your coronation is kind of intense. I needed a minute." He sat beside her, comfortable with silence in a way that had taken years to achieve. "I wouldn't be here without you. You know that, right? Not just alive, but here. Actually able to do this job. Actually wanting to." "You would have figured it out," Molly said. "Maybe. Eventually. But you gave me something nobody else could. You gave me proof that I wasn't broken. That being different didn't mean being wrong." He smiled, his scales shifting to that warm amber color that meant contentment. "You gave a scared kid in a market a hug. And somehow, that saved an empire." Molly laughed. "When you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous. The best things usually do." Emperor Tavin stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Come on. My first act as emperor is declaring that you're officially off duty for the rest of the day. I think you've earned it." As Molly took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, she thought about that day in the market. About a crying child and a choice to help instead of walking past. About how the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways you never expected. Sometimes saving the galaxy didn't require weapons or superpowers or grand gestures. Sometimes it just required seeing someone in pain and deciding they mattered. Sometimes it just required being human.